Hey guys, it's Matt Gray from Cheltenham UK Philosophers here. Um, just had a fantastic conversation with Matt Segall, the renowned process philosopher. Um, he's well decorated, respected academic. He's associate professor of philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He's published three fantastic books: The Reemergence of Schelling, Philosophy in a Time of Emergency in 2014, Physics of the World Soul, Whitehead's Adventure in Cosmology in 21, and Crossing the Threshold, Etheric Imagination in the Post-Kantian Process Philosophy of Schelling and Whitehead. That's 23, which is no longer last year because it's 25, so Happy New Year to everybody. Thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. We touched on psychedelics, metaphysics, ethics, ecology, cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, obviously A.N. Whitehead, and the limits of knowledge laid down by Kant, so the sort of Kantian threshold and post-Kantian metaphysics. And we touched on the work of sort of Kastrup, Hoffman, Levin, and Sheldrake, and it was just a really, really, really fun conversation. I could just listen to this Matt all day, and yeah, awesome. Hope you enjoy it. Speak soon. Bye. Hi, Matt.
Hey, Matt.
I'm sure you're probably aware that Matthew means gift from Jehovah in ancient Hebrew.
Yes,
So
that's right.
I'm sure that is true for yourself. But, all of my friends know this. So I thought we could perhaps start. I mean, you're obviously a renowned sort of Whiteheadian thinker. You're an expert on process philosophy and process theology and so on and so forth, but amongst other things. But could you give us a bit of a kind of informal, introduction to sort of where you've come from, how you ended up getting that sort of philosophical itch that
Mm,
led you into the path of Whitehead and so on. So what's your background?
mm. Yeah, well, excited to chat with you, Matt. Yeah, Whitehead's definitely become like my home base at this point, but I am deeply devoted. It's not just an interest, it's a real devotion to philosophy as a life path. And I'm lucky enough that I get to teach and do research and that they pay me to do this. I still have to pinch myself every morning and just I'm so thankful that that there's still enough interest and passion around these ideas, that I get to do this for a living. I usually refer back to an experience I had as a 7-year old to explain how I got onto the philosophical path. I'll give the short version of the story. Basically, I realized my mom was going to die just sort of spontaneously one day. She's still alive, perfectly healthy at the time, but it was just this realization that eventually she would die. And that really tore me up for a few weeks. I was just crying and worried that I wouldn't see her again if I went to school, um, and that it lasted a few weeks. And it wasn't until I considered my own death that this sense of dread of my mom dying began to shift. Because when I faced death uh, directly as something that I myself would eventually experience, all of a sudden it wasn't so terrifying and became more mysterious. And that contemplation as a 7-year old, in very simple terms, without any vocabulary or understanding of philosophy or the history of spirituality and how people have culturally found ways of, dealing with death, I was hooked, just in that sense of wonder that contemplating death inspired in me. And again, I didn't have the words for it as a 7-year old, but I was a very curious kid. I loved to watch people and was just a quiet kid and sensitive to these subtle psychological and social dynamics that I would see going on around me, and just took a really deep interest in the human condition, and had a couple of really influential teachers in high school, exposed me to some ideas. I didn't really become a reader until maybe junior, but really senior year of high school, and started to become a voracious, just have a voracious appetite for books, and started reading Carl Jung and Alan Watts and Friedrich Nietzsche. Maybe a little too early. Didn't understand what I was reading as an 18-year-old, but it had an attitude about it that I liked. Um, and yeah, wasn't um, exposed to Whitehead until after high school. I was listening to some lectures by a psychedelic philosopher named Terence McKenna, who mentioned he drops Whitehead's name here and
Mm.
there. Alan Watts also dropped Whitehead's name in some of the lectures I was listening to from him. But I was warned not to study Whitehead alone, but to do it formally in grad school, and got to study with a professor named Eric Weiss, who has since passed on beginning in 2009. No, 2008, actually. I took my first course with him on Whitehead and never looked back. I was just hooked. There's something about Whitehead's philosophy that's so comprehensive and also applicable to so many different domains of experience that I haven't gotten bored with it all these years later. Um, but I'm also very interested in the history of philosophy, going back to, at least in the West, going back to the pre-Socratics, and I'm a big Platonist. And I like to study philosophy as an evolution of consciousness, not just as a history of ideas, but like um, shifting worldviews and like the very way human beings perceive reality has shifted over the course of millennia. And I think philosophy, the history of philosophy reflects that and can help us um, find guidance in the present as we, face a very uncertain future. Um, and so now a lot of my work is, yeah, trying to deal with what's called the meta crisis, um, where socially, ecologically, the human species seems to have reached a breaking point where the old ways of thinking and doing and being are no longer adequate to the circumstances we find ourselves in. And we need more than just new philosophical perspectives to deal with this situation, but I think our basic attitude and um, view of what the human being is and our role in the universe needs to change, right? And so there's a bit of a chicken and an egg thing with like, oh, is it the worldview first that needs to change, or is it our institutions? Does this need to be a ground up political revolution, or do we need to shift individual consciousness first? And I think, all of it at once. And I just happen to be more perhaps better situated to address the philosophical side of this crisis. So,
Mm.
yeah.
How well does Whitehead lend himself to this crisis in terms of his metaphysics, and how would they apply to a sort of modern problem?
Yeah. Well, in his book, his 1925 book, Science of the Modern World, which is now 100 years old, he was already recognizing the way in which this obsolete already then mechanistic worldview um, led us to imagine that the natural world around us only had value uh, if we, as human beings, attributed value to it.
Mm.
And um, that's not only anthropocentric, but even uh, the type of value that human beings attributed to nature is often purely economic. I mean, there were movements already early in the 20th century to, in the US at least, to establish like the national parks. And there was this sense, oh, we should protect the wilderness, protect the environment. But um, even there, the values were aesthetic and very anthropocentric. But for the most part, value in our world 100 years ago and still today, if not more so today, is based on economic profitability. And Whitehead warned that if we continue to ignore the intrinsic values of the natural world around us,
Mm.
the value that other species have just in and of themselves without human beings having to place any value upon them, whether economic or aesthetic or any other type of human value.
Well, of course, we emerge from that world, don't we? You know, we are of that
Exactly.
world as opposed to distinct entities from it, and that's something to do with that shift, is it perhaps?
Exactly. Exactly. And so rather than thinking that the human being is the sole source of value in the universe, we, from Whitehead's point of view, need to come to an understanding of our own values as derivative from
Mm.
the cosmos, derivative from the rest of the community of life on Earth, so that we inherit our sense of value from these wider, much more ancient life processes, right? Um, and
Mm.
it's a tremendous decentering of the human being and a humbling, but at the same time an acknowledgement of our power because we can and are destroying the life systems of the planet. And because we're so alienated from those life systems, we're only now beginning to wake up to the danger that we're putting our own species in by undermining the conditions of our own survival. So acknowledging the intrinsic value of the living world was, I think, something that very few philosophers were aware of. Whitehead wasn't the only one back then, but he was one of the very prescient uh, thinkers who was warning about the trajectory we were on. And I think much of what he warned about has come to pass, you know, and on some level, so much has been lost already. It's not that it's entirely too late, but um, there's so much that we can't recover that's already been lost.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, this is fascinating because you know it's quite easy to get lost in the details of metaphysics, but with
Yeah.
it seems to me that your metaphysics actually have applicability to the real world. Because given, you know, I mean, could I just run this past you? So, is it because of the process nature of Whitehead's thinking that it's sort of less objectified, if you like? So it's less about counting objects in the world, and so that can ramify in terms of economics and cultural sort of attitudes and so on. Is this the kind of thing we're talking about?
Yeah, well, it's, you know, he has a different approach to um, what scientific knowledge would amount to. I think the
Mm,
scientific materialist project was originally rooted in the idea that we could come to have certain knowledge and as a result of that knowledge, kind of absolute control over um, natural systems. Because if the universe is primarily mechanistic, all we need to do is reverse engineer those mechanisms, understand the mathematical principles
mm,
that underlie them, and then when we find the right model, that we, you know, there was this tendency in among the scientific materialists and mechanists to equate model and reality. It's not like the ancient, you know, prior to the scientific revolution, the medieval and ancient thinkers, uh, you know, like Archimedes, an ancient engineer, had a very detailed understanding of mechanism. It's just that these ancient thinkers never got the strange idea to identify the mechanisms and the models that they could mathematically work out with the way that nature operates because they understood nature to be alive
mm,
and even ensouled. And
mm,
something shifted with, you know, Descartes and Newton, Galileo, and the other sort of founders of this new scientific materialist approach,
mm,
um, where all of a sudden, yeah, nature was equated to a machine, and this pursuit of knowledge that would give us a certain degree of prediction and control over nature became the primary drive underlying motivating science. And Whitehead is shifting our conception of what it would mean to know nature because, as you're saying, there's this um, process dimension to his understanding of reality. There's also a relational dimension. So often his metaphysics is called process relational metaphysics or ontology, because what there finally are for Whitehead are not bits of matter moving around in empty space that might be geometrically modeled with absolute precision. Um, you know, there's this old idea of nature at an instant and simple location. And from
mm,
Whitehead's point of view, with quantum theory and with relativity theory, and then even before that, there was this rise of statistical methods in science where, if you want to understand um, how gas operates. Like we're not gonna be able to track every individual molecule, but statistically in large aggregate, we can, get a sense for how gases will behave. And so
Mm,
there's already an epistemological shift going on. And Whitehead is kind of spelling out the metaphysical consequences of the shifts that already occurred within science
mm,
in the early 20th century. And so knowledge becomes less about being absolutely precise and certain, and more about knowing how to enter into relationships with uh, these processes that we're embedded within.
mm,
And, we're navigating in a Whiteheadian universe, we're navigating relationships with living systems that are responsive to our ways of looking at them and our ways of, uh, you know, interacting with them, so that it's not just dead inert stuff out there that's indifferent to how we observe it.
mm,
I mean, this is very obvious to biologists and ethologists who are
mm.
studying animals.
That reminds me of something Rupert Sheldrake comic mentioned. He said that he wasn't cool with chopping animals up to try and understand animals. He
Right.
thought, let's actually just interact with them and observe them and so on and so forth. And that's quite interesting, isn't it? So, totally, rather than using them as an object for human advantage, actually
Right. Right.
respecting what they are and what they represent and so on.
Yes.
Could I just while I remember, I just want to what did Whitehead think about space? Was space a sort of was it a given in his system, or is it like
Mhm.
an emergent property, or what did he say about space?
Well, he said there's no such thing as empty space.
Okay.
I mean, he fully accepted the relativistic um, paradigm shift. He had
Hmm.
some critiques of Einstein. We can get into those details, but in general, the idea of space and time, or space time, not as like space doesn't exist independently of the matter which floats in it.
Mm,
For Whitehead, space is actually it's more like a field of potentiality. It's the way in which occasions of experience, in his terms, actual occasions of experience, relate to one another.
mm,
And so rather than thinking of space as already existing and then you have entities that inhabit that space,
mm,
for Whitehead, space emerges from the relationships
mm,
among actual occasions. And
mm,
so it's a bit of a figure ground shift. And
mm.
it's even more, I would say it's even more relativistic than Einstein's conception.
Mm. So it doesn't
Um,
presuppose some medium through which these entities can relate. It's more about just the relationship itself. So I mean, this reminds me of some of what Chris Fields has been doing on
mm,
his physics as information processing, because he assumes nothing as well. He just says, look,
right,
there are these entities communicating information across boundaries, and
right.
just sort of pairs it back to the absolute essentials, and it doesn't assume space or time, I don't think.
Mm,
So sorry to interrupt. Please do carry on. But I mean, I'd also, what did he say about time?
yeah.
That would be good.
Well, I mean, he's a process philosopher. And so on the one hand, time is very important and irreducible, but there's a difference between clock time, that time that we can measure, um, and lived time, let's say, or
Mm,
a kind of creative unfolding. So, in physics, most of the equations of physics and relativity theory and quantum theory, um, the direction of time is irrelevant. The laws of physics work just as well in either direction. And so that's the only approach in physics that where time as a directional process features would be in thermodynamics, because there's this movement towards a direction, towards entropy, towards disorder, and movement towards equilibrium. But for the most part in physics, uh, time is this parameter that can go in either direction, which stands in sharp conflict to our perception of time, our experience of time, which is an irreversible forward moving process. Forward in the sense of, the past has already occurred, the future has not yet occurred, and we exist always in this, in Whitehead's terms, a perpetually perishing present, which is to say, the present doesn't last. and yet there's nowhere else we could ever be. But there's something about the nature of time as creative becoming. So not what we can measure in a quantitative way, but this qualitative unfolding of time that Whitehead would call creative advance. That his description of that would be a process that is iterative, meaning there's a kind of cycling. We're always in the now, but the now is always incorporating what has perished, and repeating everything which has occurred before. But not only is time iterative in Whitehead's sense, but it's cumulative, so that no
Mm.
two moments are ever the same because they're going to be incorporating the just prior moments, right? And so for Whitehead, time is this, like, yeah, it's a cyclical but a cumulative process, and so no two moments are the same. Every new drop of experience, every new actual occasion of experience is unique in world history. And there's a creative unfolding that for Whitehead is it's going somewhere. It's not going to climax in some final moment at the end of time. It's an endless process.
Mm.
Uh,
I
but there
remember
is a
McKenna talked about the what was it, the ideal object at
time
the end
wave
of time.
zero.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, but not the case for Whitehead though.
No, and it's interesting because McKenna, in talking about his fractal understanding of time, is this time wave model that he developed and
Mm.
supposed to end on what December 21st, 2012. And Terence McKenna died before he could see that his theory was not confirmed. On the other hand, things have gotten really weird since then, so maybe
Mm.
something has shifted. But
Mm.
he used Whitehead in a way that to support his theory that I don't think is actually a fair reading of Whitehead, and that's fine. I mean, McKenna was a creative thinker and appropriated from different philosophies in a way that served his own project, and that's just what we do as when we're creative.
Mm.
But Whitehead doesn't see an end to time. It's if I could put it this way, time is eternal, and really his whole understanding of what's happening in each present moment. He has a word for this called concrescence. It's an intersection where time and eternity meet, right? And so we're constantly being in each moment refreshed by this eternal perspective, that Whitehead uses the traditional language of God to refer to this perspective. Um, there's this eternal divine envisagement of ideal possibility, and each of our temporal moments as history unfolds is given a little injection of this eternal perspective of ideal possibility. And moment by moment, we're trying to integrate that ideal with the real, which what has actually happened. And Whitehead will say, like, history is a wreck. But we continue to soldier on. We
Mm.
continue to have hope in a better future because we're refreshed by this eternal perspective
Mm.
moment by moment. And that refreshment does, to the extent that there is a creative, um, organizational unfolding. And when we look at the history of the universe, there's an astounding amount of order and complexity. And there does seem to be an evolutionary movement towards ever more intense forms of consciousness. And so Whitehead would
Mm.
say, even though history is a mess and there's plenty of chaos and disorder and destruction, there seems to be more of a tilt towards order than towards chaos in the history of
Okay.
our universe, right?
Okay.
So that's how he understands time,
Mm.
um, more than just clock time, right? It's a real creative process with there are qualitative leaps that can occur moment by moment,
Mm.
right? So
Just there's a couple of questions there. So number one, probably a quick answer. In the same sense that he felt that time wouldn't end, did he think, would he say it had no beginning, or was there a beginning? No beginning. So
no
it's eternal.
beginning,
It literally is. It's eternal. And okay, I like that.
continuous creation.
Mm.
Uh, so Whitehead his metaphysics would extend beyond Big Bang theory,
Mm.
this idea that space and time have some origin point.
Mm.
Um, However, he has this idea of what he calls cosmic epochs, and that there's this creative plenum. I mean, for him, the ultimate is creativity. Everything comes out of what he calls creativity, which is very difficult to characterize because there's nothing that isn't an expression of creativity. But that would exist uh, prior to any particular cosmic order emerging. And it could be that there are different cosmic epochs uh, elsewhere in the multiverse, if you will. And so there are ways of making Whitehead's metaphysics compatible with a Big Bang theory, but I think his understanding of the deep structure of reality would lend itself more to an idea of like continuous creation rather than creation being a sort of one-time event,
Mm.
right? And I mean, there's so many options on the table in contemporary physical cosmology now, different models for understanding the origin of the universe. It's kind of the Wild West right now.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, and I think Whitehead's metaphysics can provide us with some scaffolding to begin to make sense
Mm.
uh, of the options in a logically coherent and empirically adequate way.
Mm.
So
We
a lot
seem
of
to have got
my,
to the point where science is making weird, or physics mostly is making weirder claims than any mysticism, really. Uh,
especially physics, yeah, true.
infinite numbers of universes being generated at infinitesimal points in space time. It's just kind of mind-blowingly crazy, but yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting stuff. So also, I guess that I've done a bit of reading. I'm struggling on with it, and I know it's a bit of a cliche, but he is quite hard to sort of read through, and I think it's something about the jargon and terminology that he uses. But it is actually workable if you just take the time and put the effort in, take notes, revisit. It does slowly but surely soak in, and I think some of it has, hopefully. But I mean, one of the things I'm getting from it is that he's not teleophobic, is he? So he's perfectly happy to see that there is a creative direction of travel for the cosmos, right? And for me, in some sense, my intuition tells me that that's kind of obvious. When you look at sort of evolution as an obvious example, that there seems to be a direction of travel, as you hinted at earlier. There's pursuit of complexity, or as McKenna might say, novelty. So what are your views on this stuff? And is there a sense in which we can join that journey, or can we resist it? Or how does it bear on sort of personal decisions and so on and so forth?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think there was clearly a lot of teleophobia in the origins of modern science. The medieval world, very influenced by a certain form of theology, was uh, pursuing forms of teleological explanation that were kind of, well, overly anthropocentric, such that the purpose of all these different processes in nature was always to serve the human being because, God put us at the center of creation. And it was a very naive form of teleology. And the sorts of purpose um, that medieval theologians and scholastics were beginning to imagine as operative in nature were of the sort that you might expect from a picture of the divine as a kind of engineer or a mechanic, and imposing purpose or design on the universe from outside the universe. And on some level, even though modern science went to great lengths to deny teleology and focus only on mechanical causes, there's another sense in which, for thinkers like Descartes and Newton, unless they had this kind of theology in the background where God was imagined as a great engineer and a mathematician, they never would have expected to find mathematical laws in nature. And so there is a real sense in which there are theological underpinnings or presuppositions that led at least these early scientists to
Mm.
search for the intelligibility of nature in mathematical terms. But that is, I think, a deep conflict in the scientific worldview, that it comes out of this form of theology, and yet very quickly as we enter into the 19th century, really, all of a sudden, God becomes a hypothesis that scientists no longer want to make reference to, and everything is explained purely in terms of purposeless, um, the playing out of mechanical processes that have no underlying purpose. And Whitehead's trying to bring teleology back into the picture here, but not of the kind that we would describe as design coming from um, a God who is separate from the world. For Whitehead, teleology is immanent. Um, it stems from the desires that individual creatures have to intensify their experience and to forge new relationships to support the intensification of that experience. And so rather than thinking of, say, in the biological realm, in the way that Darwin only allowed, there's a little bit of teleology in Darwinian biology, which is that organisms want to survive, right? That's the one little bit of purpose that a mechanistic biologist will allow for, that there's a survival instinct. Where does that
Mm,
come from? Oh, I don't know. We'll just assume that, and then we can get
mm,
evolution and natural selection going. Whitehead says if you actually observe life in an unbiased way, whether your own instincts or any other animal or organism, there's more than just a survival instinct. Organisms want to thrive. There's
mm,
there's like experience is enjoyable. And Whitehead says, look, if natural selection and this desire to survive is the only thing that counts in biological evolution, why is it that we see organisms that are more complex and more sensitive, but comparatively deficient in survival power evolving? Like the human being is very fragile
mm,
in comparison to bacteria, which are nearly indestructible and have been around for billions of years
mm,
and functionally immortal. I mean, they don't sexually reproduce; they just make copies of themselves.
mm,
It's a much more efficient form of life. And so, if natural selection and the ability to survive in various environments is what really matters,
mm,
the peak of life was bacteria. And so, why all of this extra complexity? Why all of this extra sensitivity? Because I mean, yeah, we can enjoy our experience more, but we also feel a lot more pain and suffering. And so, Whitehead thinks there must be another principle at play here, which is that life has this intrinsic desire to enhance its experience, right? To intensify experience. And so that adds another factor. It's not that Darwin's process of natural selection is
mm.
not occurring, it is,
And we know
but
that
it's
that
not.
applies to the individual organism and their lifetime. They pursue more food and more happiness and more contentment or
Right.
whatever. So why
Right.
not sort of scale that up, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And it's not, this isn't the kind of teleology that determines in advance what types of forms will be realized in the living world or in the universe, right?
Mm,
It's very open-ended, but there is an internal drive to explore
mm,
uh, that uh, I think is not factored into the Darwinian understanding of evolution, right? And
mm.
so Whitehead says yes to Darwin, and there's more going on.
But do you think that actually, looking at some of the cutting edge science these days, we're beginning to see a more we're beginning to see more sort of telos. You know, if you consider the work
Yeah.
of Mike Levin, for example, I mean, they're looking at the extremely basic systems like things like sorting algorithms that seem to delay gratification, and so it seems to be present everywhere. And this leads me to sort of a metaphysical question. I mean, are you a panpsychist? And I've heard that there's a sort of distinction. There's a sort of object panpsych or substance panpsychist, like the likes of Philip Goff and so on. But you're more of a sort of process panpsychist. Is that right? Is that fair
Yeah,
assessment?
yeah, and I'm happy with the panpsychist label. It can sometimes be misleading because there are different forms, different species of panpsychism
Mm,
that are quite different from one another in their implications. But the idea that some degree of experience or mentality or subjectivity, whichever word you want to use, goes all the way down, I think I would affirm that. Whitehead
mm,
affirms that. Um, and so panpsychism is a fair label. And I usually think of four basic positions in metaphysics that are historically and contemporarily sort of available to us. There's materialism, dualism, panpsychism, and idealism. Um, and when I look at contemporary biology, Mike Levin's a great example of this, but there are others, Dennis Noble. I could come up with a long list of biologists who think, and philosophers of biology who think that purpose is a real part of the living world, if not the cosmos as a whole. And so there's a major paradigm shift happening in biology, but the old guard is still, alive and well. And
Mm.
Richard Dawkins
Dawkins
is
and co.
very, yeah, he's very articulate and still has a 1960s understanding of what is state of the art in biology. And,
Mm.
for him coming of age, doing his PhD research and writing his famous books like The Selfish Gene in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, molecular biology and this genetic reductionism was all the rage.
Mm.
But it turns out that that's a dead end.
Mm.
Um, there's more than genes going on.
Mm.
But I've heard Dawkins quite recently give his spin on the whole situation, and he thinks none of the research in the last 50 years changes anything.
Even
Whereas
Noble, he doesn't think Noble changed anything. But
he thinks,
Lamarckism is sort of back in the room now, isn't it? Really, to a,
I
to a
think
degree.
so.
Yeah.
I think so, but Dawkins will reinterpret everything that's been found to make it compatible with a gene-centric perspective, which he
Mm.
thinks ultimately is what's going on. And so, science can become just as much a kind of certain scientific perspectives can function just as much like religions,
Mm. Yeah.
as traditional religions can. And so I think for Dawkins, his scientific perspective is a worldview, and it functions not just as a means of, producing knowledge, but as a source of meaning, as a source of morality, and
Yeah.
it's a comprehensive picture.
It's a
Uh,
responsibility, isn't it?
right.
Mm.
Yeah, and he's a brilliant communicator of science,
Mm.
but I think he's his science is out of date, I would say.
Mm.
Um, and
So
it's
is there
exciting.
some sort of an awakening going on across science? And there's a lot more sort of integrated work, isn't there? Convergences and so on, and that seems to be where the fruit is born. And any thoughts? Are we kind of emerging from the materialist paradigm? Is that happening now?
I see a lot of signs of that. And I think that is happening within the scientific community. It's happening within academia a little, but more slowly in those professional settings. But when I look at the culture at large, many, many intelligent people are increasingly skeptical of materialism
Mm.
and more open to panpsychism and idealism. Um, and I think that's a very positive sign.
Mm.
There are risks that come along with that. But there are risks that come along with adopting a materialist worldview as well, as Rupert Sheldrake's always saying, it's
Mm.
probably really bad for our mental health
Mm.
uh,
Yeah.
to have this materialist outlook.
Yeah, if you think you're a
Um,
mindless automaton, that can't be good for morale.
yeah, yeah, and
How
see,
can,
there
how
are
can
some,
how does that view help anybody?
yeah, there are still scientists like, Robert Sapolsky, probably the most famous among them, who
Mm.
will argue for this really hardcore deterministic point of view and that free will, any sort of will or effort is just an illusion, and we're the victims of cause and effect understood in a mechanistic way, and the
Mm.
victims are genes. And I think that's a totally um, dysfunctional point of view from my
Mm.
perspective, not only because of its negative moral consequences, and there is a lot of psychological research that
Mm.
suggests when you tell people that they're deterministic, that determinism is a fact,
Mm.
right before they take a test and have an opportunity to cheat on that test.
Mm.
If you tell them that they're free or tell them that they're determined beforehand, um, those who are told they're determined are more likely to cheat
Is that
because,
right? That's
yeah, yeah.
that's fascinating. Of course, because that
So,
absolves them of any guilt, doesn't it?
yeah, and in mental health contexts,
Mm.
they've done studies about the language that psychiatrists use when they talk about different mental disorders, and if they use
Mm.
more mechanistic language and make the patient feel like, oh, it's determined by your genes, it's determined by your
Mm.
brain chemistry, they tend to be more to have worse mental health outcomes than if there's emphasis placed on your own willpower, your own outlook, and changing your own perspective.
Mm,
So how we talk about these things does feed back on our experience. And
mm,
but regardless of that, sort of the pragmatic consequences of how we think about these things, I think it's just scientifically short-sighted to say
mm.
that everything is deterministic and
Yeah.
mechanistic. There are good
Yes, as you
scientific
pointed out
reasons
earlier,
to.
it's just not working anymore. We've actually so you could say that actually it's some sort of awakening, but actually it might just be a pragmatic thing that science is saying, well, actually these old models don't work, and
Yeah.
we're banging our heads against a brick wall here, and so yeah, they had to change. But no, sorry, do go on. That's fascinating.
Yeah, well, just to say, like the way that materialism and mechanism had classically been understood
Mm,
by 19th century science, say that whole perspective was destroyed by science itself with the
mm,
quantum and relativistic revolutions in the early 20th century. So physics itself has destroyed mechanistic materialism,
mm,
right?
right.
And I think a lot of scientists are still catching up to that. And there's been a prohibition against metaphysics in academia for a while. It's changing now in dramatic ways, but for the better part of the 20th century, philosophers were not really given the opportunity to engage with quantum physics in a way that would allow us to do the metaphysical deep dive that would provide an alternative ontology to the old mechanistic ontology.
Mm,
Whitehead was one of the few that tried to do that, but he was doing it just at a time in the 1920s when philosophy was becoming more analytic, more focused on language, linguistic analysis.
logical
And
positivists, yeah.
yeah, exactly. And so these grand metaphysical projects and doing philosophical cosmology just fell out of favor.
Mm,
But again, that's shifting. I really do feel like there is a shift within academia, within the profession of science, as well as in the broader culture.
mm.
Yeah.
I timed going to university. I studied philosophy as a mature student at 27, and I
Mhm.
wanted to do my dissertation on Berkeley and Berkeley and idealism. And they just said, "Don't be daft. Why would you want to do that? That's all that stuff is solved. It's rubbish." And they tried to get me to do one on Wittgenstein, his early
Of
work.
course.
I ended
Uh-huh.
up doing some ethics of euthanasia, which is slightly
Hmm.
dark, but difficult topic. But yeah,
Hmm.
they didn't really encourage anything other than sort of materialistic or wait. I mean, essentially, logical positivism just wipes any metaphysical speculation off the table, doesn't it? And says
Right.
if it can't be
Yeah.
weighed and measured, or it doesn't have logical cogency, it's not worth talking about.
Right.
Um, so, so you're a Whiteheadian, but that's not all you are, Matt, is it? I mean, because I've heard you speak in some detail about Kant, and so I'd like to get into the sort of Kantian threshold, the limits of knowledge, and how can we have metaphysical knowledge?
Mm.
Because I mean, while science is perhaps getting a little bit more amenable to non sort of materialist thinking, it still raises questions about the very notion of identity and what can we really know when we're arguably trapped inside this sort of perceptual bubble? We're in a
Mm.
theater of perception that's derived from something, but how do we know what's out there, and how can we talk about that? Is that a fair
Mm.
question?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Kant's critical philosophy really does challenge this old style of metaphysical speculation, where from Kant's point of view, these dogmatic metaphysicians, as he called them, were making
Mm,
claims about realities that were beyond our experience. Um, from Kant's point of view, we don't actually have any experience of the soul as a substantial reality. In other words, we have a psychological experience. We have a sense of being subjects and so on, but we're never given experiential exposure to the idea of the soul as an immortal substance. Like that's a
mm,
theological idea that dogmatic metaphysics just assumed, right? And built expansive worldviews around. And
mm,
Kant says, we really need to do philosophy in a more scientific way. Let's be grounded in our experience. Kant wanted to justify necessary and universal knowledge that, in other words, scientific knowledge, but he did so in a way that limited that scientific knowledge to the realm of phenomena, right? To our experience and what nature is in itself or what reality is in itself. Kant would just say we don't know that and we can't know that. Um,
Mm,
and for Kant, it was good that we couldn't know that because he wanted to be able to say uh, that human freedom will always be irreducible to any scientific mechanistic account of the phenomenal world, of the way that nature appears to us. There will always be something in excess of nature for Kant,
mm,
right? Which is our own human freedom.
mm,
So Kant wanted to justify scientific knowledge rigorously, logically, without relying on any metaphysics that would make reference to objects beyond our experience. But he also wanted to do justice to our belief in freedom and morality. Without freedom for Kant, there's no morality. And by limiting scientific knowledge, which for Kant, scientific knowledge meant mechanistic understanding, limiting that to phenomena, Kant could then say, well, behind the scenes, somehow our own freedom as human beings and the mechanism of nature as it appears to us are compatible. He
mm,
can't say exactly why, but because science is limited, at least it's possible that there's some underlying magic going on. He wouldn't call it magic. He would call it some super sensible substratum that makes freedom and the mechanism of nature compatible.
mm.
And I
So it's
think,
just an accident of the time that he was born, in some sense, that he developed some of these ideas. It was in response to the scientific knowledge of the day. So if he was launched into modern times, would he have a different view, do you think?
oh, I mean, undoubtedly, hard to say what Kant would make of modern science, but and the contemporary situation. But yeah, he was very adept at Newtonian physics. He understood the math. He was an astronomer before he, got into developing this transcendental approach to philosophy. But it was also the criticisms of um, rationalism and the criticisms of the idea that we could have scientific knowledge of something like causality that came from empiricists like David Hume,
Mm,
that, as Kant said, awoke him from his dogmatic slumber. And so he needed to come up with new justifications for causality because, from Hume's point of view, right, famously, we don't perceive necessary connection between events. We assume them. We assume these connections as a result of habit and custom.
mm,
And so, Kant had to do all of these gymnastics, the quite brilliant gymnastics to show how, okay, maybe causality isn't something we perceive, but it's a category in terms of which we have to interpret our experience.
mm,
And so he's able to respond to Hume and avoid the more radical implications of Hume's skepticism. But he has to sacrifice a lot to do that, which
mm,
is, like I was describing earlier, science is no longer telling us what nature is in itself. It's only telling us how nature appears to our kind of mind.
mm,
And so, I really do take Kant's criticism of traditional metaphysics, dogmatic metaphysics, seriously. And so, how do we do metaphysics after Kant? Well, I would say it has to be experientially grounded. We can't be making reference to that which is by definition beyond our experience. And so our categories and our concepts must be adequate, not only adequate to what we experience, but I would say the whole purpose of philosophy takes on, for me, a pragmatic orientation, which is to say, we only know, and this is coming out of William James and Charles Saunders Peirce, who are all important influences on Whitehead, we only know what a concept means ultimately because of our awareness of its consequences for our experience. How does thinking in this way change my experience? How does it change what I can perceive? How does it change what I can do, what I imagine I can do, and so what I can then do?
mm,
And so I think there's more to experience than Kant thought. For Kant, you know, the forms of intuition of space and time were fixed in this Euclidean way. He acknowledged the role of imagination as quite powerful. Interestingly, in the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, he kind of tones down the role that imagination plays a little bit because I think he was a little uncomfortable with the implications there. But one of the implications, I think, is when we recognize the imaginative ground of our experience, the structure of our experience is actually far more malleable. And through creative philosophical efforts,
Mm.
coming up with new concepts, as Whitehead does, which is what makes him difficult to read initially, because he's really reinventing not only a new language, but a new categorical scheme, as he calls it, a new set of concepts through which to interpret, not only interpret, but transform our experience, right?
Mm.
And so when we approach experience not as something fixed and already preformed, but as something more malleable and open to experimental transformation, then all of a sudden we can engage metaphysics in a more experimental way,
Mm.
grounded in experience rather than always claiming, as it had before Kant, to know things beyond experience. All we have is experience, right? But philosophy can allow us uh, to transform that experience,
Change
right?
our
And so
minds. We can change, literally, we can change our minds, and we can and
we can
change
change it.
the
Yes,
nature of incoming experience according to some
exactly.
of that sort of altered frame of reference. Can you think of any sort of examples of that? I mean, I suppose perhaps you could talk about maybe the sort of practice of meditation or the way you respond to the world. Can you give me some sort of examples of that, some concrete?
Hmm. I mean, one of the powerful examples that comes to mind immediately is William James in his battle with depression. He was really exploring these ideas of determinism and free will.
Mm.
And, in his book, Will to Believe, he describes his own realization upon recovering from depression that this idea of freedom is uh, how to describe this? It has whether or not we think freedom or determinism is real has real consequences for our mental health, right? And
Mm.
so
Yeah.
when he would be asked if we were to ask William James, um, are we free or are we determined? He would say, well, if you believe that you're free, then you're free, or you have at least some willpower to change your circumstances. If you believe that there's no freedom,
Mm.
then you're determined,
Mm.
right? And he realized that his own depression was only alleviated by his shift in belief
Mm.
that I'm going to take this idea of freedom seriously and thereby become free,
He
right?
literally had invented a new world in which he was free,
Yeah.
in some sense.
And
Um,
experience is that malleable.
mm. I suppose another example might be your metaphysics would have some impact on how you respond to death, for example. So, I
Oh,
mean,
right.
if you're utterly convinced that, say, something like idealism is the case, then you're going to say consciousness is fundamental, and these bodies are sort of representations of some mentation, right?
Mhm.
And so the death of the physical body is not, that can't kill consciousness, right? It's a
Yeah.
completely different sort of category.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, again, it's I sometimes I have to fight a bit of a battle with friends of mine about the relevance of philosophy in the modern world, and it's because of things like this that I think it is absolutely relevant, and so just setting aside the ethics and everything else. Um, so I was going to
Yeah.
ask, so what are your views on death?
Hmm.
And because we touched on this earlier, and it tells us something about the nature of reality, doesn't it? That it doesn't necessarily care so much for the woes of the individual, and or maybe it does, and maybe there's some necessity to having anxiety to perpetuate the species and so on and so forth as part of this grand foliation. But it does seem a bit mean, doesn't it? And to give these entities all this uncertainty about it as well. And
Hmm.
why would that? Any thoughts on this anyway?
Yeah. I mean, no, there's so much to say about death and the way that human culture is so profoundly shaped by our response to
Mm.
death, and different cultures have different responses to it. And I think so much of what drives contemporary consumerist culture is a kind of denial of death. We want we and expect that or many people expect that technology and medical advances will eventually allow us to defeat death. There's a whole transhumanist movement that refers to people who find death to be something essential to life that we have to accept. They call us, I count myself among those people, they call us deathists because for them, for these transhumanists, death is just a disease that we should cure.
Mm.
I
It's a
don't think they've
medical problem kind of thing. It's yeah.
yeah, it's a medical problem. It's a limitation that increasing knowledge can eliminate. But I don't think they've really thought through what a human being who lives forever, what a life that's indefinite, where we're functionally immortal, what that would really be like, and how much actually of the deepest meaning that we find
Mm.
in our lives comes from its finitude.
Mm.
And is it really possible to love someone if there's no risk of losing them, or if that time that we have together on this earth is indefinitely prolongable? I mean, I think it really does start to change the deep existential structure of human existence when we consider eliminating death somehow. Um, I think there are a lot of other ways that that sort of transhumanist project can go wrong, but I also think if we were to want to develop, say, a more ecological approach to ethics. Environmental ethics is a big field in philosophy because we need to reimagine our relationship to the natural world.
Mm.
One of the ways I've been sort of exploring another possibility for developing an ecological ethics would be to consider reincarnation, and to do so in a more or less naturalistic way, just to relate to the whole history of life on Earth, all of the species which have existed, and the lineages that we as human beings are born out of. We are the reincarnation of this continuous
Mm.
stream of successful organisms. I mean,
Mm.
99% of all the species to ever have existed have gone extinct, but for those organisms that are alive today, we inherit the achievements of billions of years of
Mm.
evolutionary struggle and joy, I think.
Mm.
Um, and so, in a real evolutionary sense, um, reincarnation is real,
Mm.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and
And
so I
basically, it's
feel
kind of
like,
eating itself as well. It's like a big
hmm,
restaurant, isn't it? We consume, that seems to be
yeah,
almost foundationally. Eating seems to be, we imbibe some of the external world into ourselves, and then put some of our own self out into the external world. And that, I mean, these are the sorts of things that you can once say they're undeniable in some
yeah,
sense. The idea of the
right,
continuation of generations and
yeah,
continuous journey
and
towards
to
war.
yeah, and but to feel okay with
Mm.
that, I
Yeah,
think,
yeah, yeah. Seeing that it's not all about you or
right.
about one. It's about the grand foliation, if you can call it that.
Yeah, no, I like that term. But we need a shift in human identity that allows us to not just consider as an idea that we are related to the rest of life on this planet. I mean,
Mm,
most educated people accept this idea of a common ancestor of all of life.
mm.
But if we
Oh
can go
yeah.
beyond just the idea of it, to
Mm,
really feel that and to identify with life as a whole,
mm,
I think, and also to consider, this reincarnational perspective, not just as a way of relating to the past, to the
mm,
history of life, but think about the future. In some
mm,
way, the damage we do today,
mm,
it's not just going to affect other people or other beings, like who we really are, our
mm,
true identity, like is continuous with this stream of life. We will
mm,
be here in the future to suffer the consequences
mm.
of what we're doing today, right? And so this broadened sense
Yeah.
of identity that I think comes along with considering a more or less naturalistic understanding of reincarnation could be really fruitful for helping us to avert, you know, catastrophe,
Mm,
uh, ecologically speaking. And so it, in terms of relating to death, it's like it doesn't make death any more difficult on some level. Like we give up a lot
Mm,
when we die, but I don't think we give up everything. Like this body, everything we've tended to identify with while alive in this body will perish.
mm,
I'm pretty sure of that. But I think that there's this underlying continuity that will continue. And I don't have any scientific proof of that, obviously. I'm building analogies,
mm,
um, and looking at, say, the way in which it's very odd that we don't fully consider this, but like we're awake for 2/3 of the day, and then for a third of the 24-hour cycle, we're asleep.
mm,
Our bodies are just vegetating there in bed, and then we wake up in the morning and continue on
mm,
with and there's this gap every day in our lives, in our stream of consciousness, and we just sort of accept that as normal. But if you really consider it,
mm,
why wouldn't we want to imagine some analogy here? Just as the life death cycle occurs every 24 hour, or the sleep wake cycle occurs every 24 hours, maybe there's a similar life death cycle which occurs, across lifetimes,
mm,
right? And it's just that we wake up as someone new, and instead of as the same person with that sense of continuity. But from
mm,
Whitehead's point of view, we're new every moment.
mm.
There's a death rebirth process happening moment by moment by moment.
And you can
Um,
almost feel that sometimes. Sometimes I almost get a sort of insight and think, actually, I've changed. I'm changed. Like,
yeah.
a certain piece of music or a film or an experience or a conversation, you come away a changed person. You can actually sense it. I wanted to ask you something, another metaphysical question. Um, is everything alive? Is there anything that is not involved in the sort of the dance of life? Because I mean, just a daft sort of example. You could imagine a planet with no kind of organic material on it, right? But it's still milling about in some sense. And it may have a predisposition towards complexity or something like that that will eventually produce these. I mean, I suppose what I'm saying is that there is no problem of abiogenesis because it seems to me that there's a continuity, as you mentioned, all the way down. So it feels that the whole cosmos is involved in this
Mhm.
unfolding, right? So, in that sense, given that we're continuous with the rest of it, then the whole thing's alive. In my humble opinion, I'm just wondering what your view is on that.
I agree. I think life is a matter of degrees,
Mm,
and there's no 0 point.
mm,
Um, but a lot depends on how we define life. And the thing is, we have one example of life on this planet. We have some evidence there may have been life on Mars and maybe on other planets in our solar
mm,
system. But as many astrobiologists will point out, because we only have one example of life, we don't really know if the sort of carbon-based substrate that we're used to is the only way that the type of chemical complexity we associate with biological organisms can do the thing. Like it could be that there are many other chemical pathways to life,
mm,
and we don't really know what we mean by life here, again, defined in terms of biological organisms, until
mm,
we have another example of it.
mm,
There could be a very different form of life, say, in the clouds of Venus,
mm.
that are
There could be life
not.
here that we just can't perceive.
That's true.
Sort of,
Well, yeah,
Donald
absolutely.
Hoffman points out quite
Mm,
well that we don't well he thinks he's shown mathematically that we don't receive any true information about the external world.
right.
So and we literally just refine our behaviors and so on based on what's beneficial to us in terms of eating and reproducing and so on. So there could be a whole host of things going on right now that and I mean, one of the other things that comes to mind is this idea of the collective intelligence. And again,
Mm.
something that Levin talks about extensively is that we're not as really a single being in a sense, that we're a, what do you call it? A community of, what's the term that you use?
Society of
A
actual
society,
humans. Yeah.
society. That's right. Yeah, and in some sense, the human body is made up of these different sort of entities. The kidney probably doesn't know that it's part of some larger system, in the same way that an ant might not know it's part of what its colony's objectives are. But yet there is this overarching telos of these organizations, and so I've forgotten where I'm going with this actually, but
Well,
um,
all intelligence is collective intelligence,
mm,
I would
mm,
say, right?
yeah, yeah,
Um, which is something that Michael Levin is constantly harping on. And there's this approach in cognitive science that's
Mm,
called extended cognition, where
mm,
instead of thinking of just individual brains as the locus of cognitive activity,
mm,
we could study intelligence. It's better to study intelligence and cognition in a more socially extended way, so that you could use a military example, like a battleship, which is composed of however many hundreds of sailors, is itself um, a cognitive system of some kind that can only perform the tasks of information processing and interpretation that it does as a result of the relationships among all of those human beings
mm,
and the tools and technologies and instruments that they're using.
mm,
And so, like, the intelligence doesn't belong to any individual,
mm. Yeah.
right?
Yeah, you could
There's
talk about
something that,
sports teams in a way in a similar fashion, couldn't you? And I think that's what I was just trying to get to, this idea that there could be a sort of meta intelligence of which we are a part. Because if we're
Mhm.
composed of these individual components, why suppose that that it stops here? Do you see what I mean?
Right.
What do you think? And is that testable? I mean, I wonder whether that's actually potentially testable. If you could observe collective action that could not be attributed to the kind of the amalgam of all of their individual goals, and it's can be shown that there's some other force involved. Maybe I don't know. It's a total speculation there, but any thoughts?
Well, I think Levin is showing how cellular collectives can achieve feats of cognitive prowess that no individual cell could do on its own, and
Mm,
that there's definitely something that emerges at the level of whole tissues and organ systems and the organism as a whole, that none of the individual cells seem to know about that as separate entities, but that is achieved at this meta level. And why wouldn't we continue that analogy up the scale, um, and consider the Earth or Gaia as this kind of collective mind that we as individuals, usually at least, are not consciously aware of participating in, but the Earth as a whole, this Gaian consciousness, could be conscious of us all, not just humans perhaps, but all living beings, in a way that we can only dimly imagine, or perhaps in some special states, altered states of consciousness, we can participate in that to some degree, and merge with the Gaian mind for a time.
mm,
Um, but I think there's every reason to take these analogies seriously, or why wouldn't nature work similarly at different scales? I
mm,
think the burden of proof would be on those who would deny that,
mm,
um, because it's like it's very easy for the materialist to say, oh, well, we know consciousness is produced by the neurons in the brain. Do we? I've never heard of a mechanism that could explain how neural activity and neurochemistry, again, imagined in a mechanistic way, could give rise to this totally other domain
mm,
called consciousness. Like I've never even seen a hypothesis that could account for that type of transition,
mm,
right? So why do we assume that brains produce consciousness and that there couldn't be some higher level consciousness where each of us is like the neuron in this larger brain, you know?
mm, mm,
So I think we should take these analogies seriously.
mm.
Yeah.
In terms of this larger brain, we could put the word God in there, couldn't we? I mean, what are your views on God? Is there some sort of cosmic intelligence of which we're a part, and perhaps it feels us, in the way that we perhaps feel an itch on our foot or something like that, or it could be phenomenally conscious of everything that we're doing. I mean, any thoughts on this stuff, and how some of the Whiteheadian thinking, or your thinking, perhaps plays into mysticism and spirituality?
Yeah, I think it's natural to move in that direction when you begin to consider a panpsychist metaphysics. William James wrote a book called A Pluralistic Universe, where he's drawing on a German scientist and philosopher named Gustav Fechner. And Fechner was a panpsychist who had a sense that we are, as human beings, enveloped within ever widening circles of consciousness larger than ourselves. And so there's the Earth consciousness, and then maybe there's a consciousness associated with the sun and the solar system as a
Mm.
whole, the whole galaxy. I mean, when I think about
That reminds me of
uh,
Olaf. Have you heard of Olaf Stapledon?
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah. Star Maker. Is that the name of
Yeah,
his?
yeah, Star
Mm.
Maker and the third and last man, I think it was the first and last man.
Right.
A massive fan, but that seemed to be the sort of thing he was talking about. That sort of eventually gets to the Godhead and understands what's
Yeah.
going on. Is trying out
I think
different
he I think he
universes.
read Whitehead too, actually.
Right, that doesn't surprise me actually.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's what a profound thinker. What a beautiful book as well.
Hmm.
But yeah, sorry, do continue. Just
Yeah. And so
reminded me there.
yeah, for good reason.
Mm,
And so it's a view of the divine that I think would be, again, less about um, a God that would be placed outside the universe. Um, and this is less monotheistic in a way because there's more of a sort of, it's like concentric circles, right? And so um, there's this term holarchy. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, that comes out of Arthur Koestler's work. The idea of a holon is like a whole part. You can't, it's not just a particle, it's not just a whole, because the thing about the way our universe is organized is it's like our bodies are whole, but they're made of cells, which themselves have a kind of wholeness. And so it's like nested holes all the way up and all the way down. And you could,
mm,
instead of describing the universe as a hierarchy, you could describe it as a holarchy. But it seems like we're nested within these layers of consciousness. They go all the way up and all the way down, and there's an increasing intensity and depth of consciousness, as you go up. But it seems like the human might be perched at a particularly
mm,
um, um, important middle place within this whole, expanse, because like it's very easy and probably seems to me correct to say that like a cell in our kidney doesn't know it's part of a human body. It's just doing its kidney thing. But human beings were at least capable of becoming aware of the fact that, wow, I'm made of cells that each seem to have their own experience, and then myself a cell in this larger
mm,
Gaian organism and the
mm,
solar system. It's like, so we seem aware of these layers to some degree,
mm,
uh, in a way that I don't know that other organisms are,
mm,
and so there's a new kind of important role for the human being, even after we get over the anthropocentrism that led to the ecological crisis,
mm,
and the appropriation of all value and purpose for just the human being. We
mm,
need to get over that, but there might be a new kind of important role for the human being when we inhabit a living universe
mm,
where, as the Buddhists would say, being human is a very auspicious occasion because we have this cosmic perspective
mm.
uh, that might not be available to other creatures.
So you were talking about us being at sort of like a midpoint somewhere between, you know, we got sort of partly divine perhaps and sort of part beast and part angel, you could say.
Right.
Is that the
Yeah.
kind of thing?
Yeah, and it's a very ancient perspective, the human being as a microcosm,
Mm,
but also the human being very much in the middle of things. From like Dante's perspective, like the earth is right between heaven and hell. But it's quite striking the way that modern cosmology and our capacity to measure the very small and the very large, we also seem to be right at the center of things. And
mm,
you might say, well, how could we not feel like we're at the center because we can only see so far in either direction?
mm,
Um, but it seems like there are real limits here. It's not just the limits of our ability to see, but that, the capacity for energy as we know it to organize itself hits a bottom floor. And similarly, when we look out at the cosmic, um, the edge of the cosmos and the microwave background radiation, it seems like the scale, the powers, the logarithmic scales here have us at the center. And so science, contemporary cosmology has kind of rediscovered this ancient understanding of the human being
mm,
um, being a fulcrum point, kind of meeting place between, yeah, the angelic and the animal,
mm,
which gives us a unique vantage point that, makes us interesting, um, even to say the angels or say even to the higher consciousnesses, that there's something unique about the human being that they're very interested in. And you see this coming through in like, um, I don't know if you're a Lord of the Rings fan.
massive Lord of the Rings fan.
So the elves are very interested in human beings because we die,
Mm, yeah,
right? And
yeah,
they're kind of envious of this
yeah,
because and I think again it speaks to the importance of death, that we shouldn't rush to eliminate death when it might be the
Mm,
most important thing about us.
mm,
And instead of just imagining it as an end and a horrible thing that we would want to avoid at all costs, it could be that um, death is the very source of the most profound meaning that
mm.
we have access to, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah. It's funny.
So,
I did have some possible pushback on that. Then I was just wondering there may be some advantages with people being, say, longer lived, not necessarily immortal, but longer lived to give you more time to sort of figure out what's going on and and how to conduct yourself. But I
well,
mean,
but if reincarnation is a thing, then we will have another chance.
indeed, indeed, because nothing's wasted. I mean, that's what I like about that vision, that reincarnation model you offered up, is that
Nothing's wasted. Yeah,
everything is significant,
right.
and that's that, so suffering, feelings of inadequacy, all this depression, all that has a function in this view, I think. But
Yeah.
what I wanted to ask you, I wanted to just because I'm conscious of time, I wanted to just get your views on psychedelics. I mean, there's a couple of burning questions. I mean, first of all, I think they have profound implications for consciousness because some of the studies that Bernardo Kastrup has popularized, he's shown that there's certain sort of states in DMT where brain activity goes down almost to zero. So you've got a brain not doing anything, and people are having the most profound experience they could possibly have.
Right.
Is it a glimpse into the transcend? Is it a glimpse into a higher consciousness of some sort? There's people that have repeated sort of experiences on DMT that are consistent across different individuals. They're doing these kind of they're putting people on drips now and having these longer term. I think that it's happening in Britain somewhere. I can't remember the university. What are your thoughts on this stuff? And then why does nature produce these chemicals or these compounds that give us these insights? I mean, McKenna obviously talked about having conversations with a great other. You sort of go into that space and ask them metaphysical questions and so on. And so, any thoughts on this? Before I babble on all night about it?
Well, I mean, on the last point, why should these chemicals, so-called, they're called secondary metabolites in the sense that mushrooms, say psilocybin mushrooms, the psilocybin genus produces these chemicals as a secondary metabolite in the sense that they're not a primary part of
Mm.
the metabolic process that the mushroom and the
They don't
mycelial
have to do
network.
it. They don't have to do it.
No,
That's
it's for
that
us.
that's
It's for,
fascinating.
and so it's a means of communicating um, that an ecosystem has to communicate
Mm,
between organisms, these secondary metabolites. And they're all psychoactive in various ways. The traditional psychedelic compounds are especially potent to mammals, it seems, but there are other animals that know to find these mushrooms and they have their experience, or other psychedelic plants. And so human beings aren't the only ones that like to alter their consciousness.
mm, mm,
But like why these secondary metabolites exist, it seems to have a lot to do with, or everything to do with this evolutionary history and the ways that tens of millions of years ago, um, insects were interacting with plants,
mm,
and our own nervous systems and neurochemistry is intimately related to the neurochemistry of insects. And these molecules evolved over the course of millions of years of interaction between insects and plants, and then eventually more complex animals and plants, as a way of, I think, of the ecosystem as a whole, you could say
mm,
of Gaia's mind of
mm,
regulating itself.
mm.
Um, and
That's amazing. The fact you can show that these species could manage without this additional functionality, but yet they do it anyway.
right,
And as I say,
right,
because it's perhaps part of some broader requirement for communication within the ground within the Gaia. That's amazing.
yeah. And there's dimethyltryptamine everywhere. It's in grass.
Mm,
It's not in tremendously high concentrations, but you could theoretically, as far as I'm not a chemist, but I've heard you can, if you get enough grass and know the chemical process to distill it, there's enough DMT in there in grass
mm,
clippings that you could, so um, this psychedelic renaissance that's going on is, I think, exciting. I
mm,
remember being in college and learning about the 1960s and the first sort of psychedelic revolution in the West. and really thinking like, gosh, it's too bad that didn't succeed. And, maybe all we need to do is spike the water with LSD, and then all the politicians would suddenly realize their mistakes. But yeah,
Mm.
I'm less naive about the potential here. It's not automatic. The thing about these psychedelics,
They could
and
have
each one,
bad trip. They could have bad trips. It would make them worse.
yeah, exactly. They can be used to treat PTSD, and they can cause new trauma if
Mm.
not done in a safe and enriching environment and context. And so
Mm. Mm.
they're not a silver bullet. They're I like one of my teachers, Stanislav Grof, described psychedelics as
Okay.
non-specific amplifiers of our existing, the terms that Tim Leary and Richard Alpert used were set and setting. So our mindset and our cultural environment, and then the very physical environment that we're in while we're tripping, has a huge influence
Mm.
on what we experience. Um,
Yeah, I mean,
and
McKenna used to go into a dark room, didn't he, and do 5 dried grams?
yeah, and he's like, don't even do it with other people. That brings
Mm.
culture into the room. And
Yeah,
if you really want
yeah.
to go, deeper than our cultural conditioning, you need to be alone when you do these things.
Mm.
Which, raises questions about the research settings where it's very much a mental health framework, where these
Mm.
are being explored right now, which is fine. I think there's lots of application there, but the experience you have in a clinical setting, a hospital room, or a square room, and they try to make it look nice,
Mm.
but you've got
That's
two therapists hovering over you. You're in bed. You've got earphones on, and
mm.
they've chosen the soundtrack of usually classical music or whatever. It's a
Mm.
very personally, I would feel quite anxious in that
Mm.
environment,
Yeah.
um, and much more comfortable either by myself or with some friends, like at the beach or in the woods.
Mm.
But from a clinical point of view, that's not safe.
Mm.
But there's
I'd
uh,
say the clinical setting is not
it's
safe.
not safe.
That's
Well,
not safe
right,
at all. Mm.
right. Um, yeah, I mean that's a whole interesting
Mm.
conversation. I mean, not to I think most therapists are honest, professional people who
Mm, of
uphold
course.
ethical boundaries, but
Yeah.
even without psychedelics involved, many therapists end up having inappropriate relationships with their clients. And when you throw
Mm.
psychedelics into the mix,
Mm.
the transference is much more intense. And so there are risks
Mm.
of, being in that clinical environment
Yeah.
that are not negligible. But just the anxiety produced by being watched by these professional
Mm.
psychologists, who with their clip pads taking notes, like when you're in a psychedelic state, that's like I get alien abduction vibes,
Yeah. And it's the last thing you want, isn't it?
Yeah.
But
Um,
Matt, do you think these entities that people encounter on DMT? I mean, I've not done DMT myself, but are they encountering agency, other agents?
hmm. I think I do think that we have to. I have had experiences of what I can only refer to as non-physical entities or agencies. Um, and it's very convincing.
Mm.
And I have enough, ability to take a skeptical stance even on my own experience to say, of course, there are many possible explanations for this. Like the brain might be hardwired to, attribute agency. Um,
Yeah, seeing faces, for example, yeah, yeah.
yeah. But on the other hand, some of the most powerful and transformative experiences of my life have been a result of encountering beings in a psychedelic state that um, have a message, and have something to convey. And I think um, this is not this is not unusual in the history of our species.
Mm.
You know, now if you're embedded in the psychedelic counterculture, you might call them self-transforming machine elves like McKenna.
Mm.
Uh, a lot of people are having what they describe as extraterrestrial encounters with aliens, but if you go back a few hundred years, people talked about angels and
Mm.
demons, and
So that
Have
reminds me of the UFO phenomena as well, because they seem to have the things that people report seeing have moved with technology, haven't they? So there's a similar
yeah,
kind of pattern there as well, perhaps. Mm,
exactly. Um, and I think the you asked about space earlier, and
mm,
I think psychedelics open up this possibility that we can begin to explore inner space in a way that would allow us to appreciate how vast that domain
mm,
is. It might even be vaster than
mm,
what we think of as the external um, cosmos. And it could be that all of intelligent life in the cosmos is interconnected somewhat like
mm,
interdimensionally or so, you could say, through this inner space of consciousness. And the best hope we have for contacting alien intelligence is not to imagine we might travel through physical space
mm,
to other solar systems. I mean, it just takes so damn long, and
mm.
that might be impractical even with more advanced technology. But maybe
Well,
we
again,
can come,
it might be a technology of some sort, maybe that Gaia has generated to enable this broader
right?
communication, perhaps.
Yeah, it's very speculative, but I think
Mm,
there's we haven't really we've just begun as with a modern scientific attitude exploring these inner domains, and I think we have a lot to learn from indigenous traditions that have been doing this for thousands of years.
mm,
Um, but I do think these entities are real in some sense.
mm,
Um, and you know, the fact that brain activity diminishes even while the intensity of what the person is experiencing goes through the roof
mm,
suggests to us that um, yeah, the brain, the nervous system is kind of a filter, and
mm.
it is actually not in the business of producing consciousness, but inhibiting consciousness, stepping it down to a level that we can manage.
Mm,
And when we take a psychedelic, it just blows the lid off.
mm,
Or as Aldous Huxley, but he's really getting it from
mm,
the French philosopher Henri Bergson, this idea of the brain as a kind of reducing valve, and psychedelics open the valve and allow mind at large to flood in.
mm,
Um, I think that's what the evidence would suggest the more appropriate model is for understanding the mind-brain relationship.
mm,
Mind and consciousness are more like this field that we tune into, that the
mm,
nervous system is a kind of antenna
mm,
or radio receiver rather than a local producer of consciousness.
mm,
And we wouldn't come to that perspective unless we had been exposed to psychedelics and been able to
mm.
experiment with these things. So
Yeah.
they're a tremendously valuable research tool, and I really advocate for thinking beyond just the medical model
Mm,
for their application. I'm quite adamant that all adults should be able to legally
mm,
use the classical psychedelics. They're way less dangerous than sugar and alcohol and tobacco
mm.
um, and many pharmaceutical drugs.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
The only
right.
reason there's cultural and moral reasons rooted in a kind of
Mm,
puritanical religious history that originally led to these things being made illegal, I think.
mm,
And the political implications in the 60s that the it was political revolutionaries who were using these things a lot.
mm,
Strangely, I think there's a lot of arguments that psychedelics depoliticized the more radical political movements in the
mm,
60s because people did turn inward instead of trying to change institutions.
mm.
So
Yeah.
there's a critique there implicit maybe in at least the um, historical effects of psychedelics. I think there are ways that they could be politically revolutionary, but they, at least in the 60s, were critiqued a lot for depoliticizing people.
Mm,
Um, but yeah, it's a very promising area of research. And I think as a philosopher, I find psychedelics to be quite powerful instruments for metaphysical exploration.
mm. Yeah.
Mhm.
This might seem a little bit left field, but do you think cryptocurrency has anything to do with this sort of, this idea or movement towards decentralization of power and sort of more kind of organic systems of organic economies and so on? Do you think crypto's got anything to do with that?
Possibly.
Well, particularly Bitcoin, set aside the altcoins, but Bitcoin, this idea that it's something you can actually own that can't be meddled with by the banks or governments and so on. So, is that part of this journey, this awakening?
It might be. I think we have to find ways of mining and maintaining the blockchain that isn't so resource intensive.
Mhm.
But there are avenues for doing that are promising. But um, I think as a way of decentralizing economic power, taking some of the power away from centralized banks, um, I think that's a very promising avenue. Um, it's such a complicated subject. I think
Mm,
this idea of like a trust-free economy, like you don't need to trust people to follow through with their transactions and stuff because the algorithm will do it.
mm,
Um, you know, I know, Bitcoin doesn't have smart contracts, but like something like Ethereum where you can just automate something that you would need a team of lawyers to
mm,
do normally in terms of what's when aspects, clauses of a contract are activated by this or that change in the market or whatever, that can all be um, built into the blockchain in a way. And so you don't need to trust people to do what they say they're going to do. It's as
mm,
soon as you agree to the contract, that's what's going to happen. But like, I,
mm,
I just feel like I'm not opposed to using technologies to make our economy function in a more transparent and distributed way. But at the same time, should we celebrate the idea that we don't need to trust each other anymore?
mm,
Like, I feel like it's a bit antisocial. And I think blockchain technology can play an important role in helping us reimagine money. Um, but Bitcoin's weird because it's not really functioning as a currency. It's
mm,
too valuable to function as a currency.
mm,
And so the original, I think, um, point of it has been lost and it's
mm.
become more like an investment.
Yeah.
Um, and where this is leading, I'm not sure, but it could be that it's not Bitcoin that ends up being the platform.
Mm,
Um, but the basic idea of blockchain and of like a world computer and massively distributing the ledger to increase the transparency of economic transactions. I think these are all positive things.
mm,
It would be great if we could, uh, in the US, when we vote, when we have our elections, we're using paper ballots, and people say, "Oh, that's safer," but it's still so easily manipulated. And if we could just get this on the blockchain,
mm,
and people could vote on their phones or whatever, it'd be
mm.
so much. I mean, I think we'd increase voter participation, and I feel like there's so many applications for the blockchain technology. It goes far beyond just Bitcoin or
Yeah.
Ethereum or particular applications, right? So
Mm.
yeah, I think it's a promising development that I'm curious to see unfold.
That's really interesting what you said there. It's emerged from the fact that we have problems trusting each other, right? So it's emerged as a kind of response to that. But yes, it does
Yeah.
take away that choice of being a good person, doesn't it? So it takes away the opportunity to do the right thing in some sense.
Mhm.
That's quite interesting. Just conscious of time here, Matt. I think you've got a few minutes left. So just to say thanks so much for coming to talk to me. You make philosophy cool. You're one of a bunch of guys that do that. I have you in there sort of with Castrop and, Philip Goff. You're making it accessible. You speak calmly, clearly, and intelligently on these topics. And it's just a massive pleasure and privilege to have you. So thank you.
Yeah, no, it's been fun, Matt. You asked great questions, and yeah, I hope it's valuable for your listeners.
Thank you very much. It's been wonderful. Hopefully we speak again sometime.
I'd like that. Yeah.
Cheers, Matt. Take care,
All
man.
right. Happy New Year.
And to you.